Arnold did its thing, and still it's pretty much real time here. The one thing I notice is that I have to unhide my environment group here because I hit that before, so we do have the ground, which just looks a little bit nicer. And we have seen that everything still works, so I'm going to close that down again because, as I said, we have to see about window management a little bit later. And let me just quickly open the Hypershade so that we can finally, as a last chapter in this series, take a look at the thing. So your Hypershade, when it opens up, it will probably look a little bit different. There will be some attribute editor here and a hardware or Arnold render preview of your material. So you have basically little shapes that you can choose a few from and some HDRI images that you can choose from to get a preview of your material. And that is slow, so you really don't need that. IPRs nowadays, so this thing here is an IPR in production renderer. It has real-time feedback, at least if you're in a GPU or if you keep your samples low, even on the CPU. Really, you can use your see your materials in context. So you really don't need that. And this attribute editor here, well, you do have an attribute editor here. I like to work with that one. You can work with that one. Doesn't really matter really. This thing here that's usually here doesn't show you all attributes that are actually on the node. So usually I'm missing something that I need. So basically that thing works better for some things. But anyway, there's this create menu, which you will probably use a lot at the start, where you can find all of the Arnold shaders, utility nodes, the Maya nodes, which you can still use. Some of them work with Arnold, some of them don't. You have to find it out for yourself. There's also this bin thing, which I could have used to organize my materials. But really, I've used another system, which is basically giving them clear tags. So in the end, you can use those bins. So you can add a few bins here, call them cockpit, fuselage, whatever. Pull all the materials down here over there and just put them in the bin. And if you select that, that's basically a collection of materials that you might need. So, but as I said, I didn't use that. So the other thing I want to warn you about, there's this little button here. This is currently set to off. It's usually set to on by default. And if you have these little shader swatches here, this will try to give you a preview of all your materials in the Hypershade. That is slow. And it's annoying how slow it actually is. So since you don't need to see a preview of your materials here, because you will most likely be running the IPR in parallel anyway, and just pause it if you don't need it, turn that off. After all, this preview is usually just not really meaningful at all, because most of the time it will just show you this little Arnold symbol, because it can't calculate the thing anyway. So you just get a preview, or maybe you just get a black shader preview or something like that, even though your shader is not black. So pretty much useless. I haven't turned that on since, I don't know, for the last 10 years or something like that. So I usually turn it off just right at the start. So yeah, basically my suggestion is to keep things running fast in here, just turn that off. You will notice a difference. It's not such a huge performance impact, but if you've loaded the file and you open the Hypershade for the very first time, this will recalculate these things. And yeah, it doesn't have to really. So I like to view my materials as a list, which isn't the nicest form of list you can have in this world, but that's the way it is. But really, I don't mind it, because honestly, you seldomly really work with that list unfiltered. So let me tell you a few things about how I organize these materials here. So this thing here, these green thingies, are all the materials that are in our scene. And as you can see, I've prefixed things. So there's a reminder what the thing is. So this env group, ground, nth ground, lumbered. Those are two materials that are assigned to my ground and my ground texture right here. I've never shown the ground, but it's another ground that I used. I'll probably delete that later. So they are prefixed with nth ground, so I know that they do belong to the environment. There's a few things here, a few shaders. This lumbered one is just the standard shader Maya assigns to everything, so that thing exists in the scene. You can access that, but you really never use that. Never change that, actually. So you can change parameters on the thing if you want to change a shader on an object, assign a shader, change that. Don't change the lumbered one. Things will break if you do at some point. So there's some other materials here, but really we don't care for them. All the materials that are on the plane are prefixed with P51D. So you can find them by just going in here and just typing P51D. So you've just filtered your list using the keyword P51D. There are other keywords within those shaders. So there's this keyword CPT right after P51D. Those are all the cockpit shaders. So you can use that to just list all of your shaders that are in the cockpit. And say I wanted to just graph every material that is on the cockpit, because maybe you want, for the people in my course, maybe you want to take a look at how I build all the shaders in the cockpit. So if you want to do that, you can do that easily. So there's these little tabs here, and let me just close that down as well. So we have a little more screen real estate here. And I didn't want to dock that, Maya, so let me just lock that here. So we do have a little more screen real estate here. So we have already looked at this one here in the Bifrost section. So there are these little tabs right here. And you can use them to organize things. Because one thing I want to warn you about is not really that much of a problem, but it's a bit confusing. In here you also can't comment your things. So this shader, although it looks a bit messy, it's actually pretty organized for what you can do in the Hypershade. It would be great if you can just use some background notes or some comments in here, basically just like in Nuke and other programs, but unfortunately you can't. So basically you have to keep in mind what you did there, and usually if you build it yourself, you do have a mind map of the layout of these things, and you find things pretty fast. If it's a long time ago that you built these things, it's probably a problem for somebody else to dig through that. It's kind of weird, but that's the way things are. It still is a good system, so that is actually pretty comfortable for shading. So yeah, could be improved, but still it's kind of awesome. So yeah, you can use that. So let's say I wanted to create a new tab, and let's just say we will call this cockpit. Enter. You have to really make sure to push the enter button here, otherwise this thing will not be renamed. So let's say I have all those cockpit materials. I can just push this little button and tell Maya to graph them here. So there's a lot of materials actually, and as you can see, these ones don't have any ingoing connection, so basically they are simple materials. You can take a look at them, but they're probably boring, so I'm just going to remove them again. Those are probably the more interesting ones. So basically you can use that to take a look at just the cockpit material. You could also, for example, this cockpit has this gun sight. You can of course filter for any word, so you can filter for gun sight and you will find that. If you're searching for a green material and you've labeled things correctly, you will probably find some green stuff in here, or whatever else you're searching for. So if you keep your naming conventions consistent, this thing can be traversed pretty fast and pretty easily, and you can always graph things. You can of course not only graph things this way, so if I do another tab here, and I'm just going to leave that as untitled, you can of course as well just select one of your objects, and let me just choose one here. Let me just use the tire. So if I have the tire is already graphed here, but I can graph that again. So if I graph that here again, This is a tire material. So what I did, I just selected the thing in the viewport, and maybe now let me select another thing. So let's say this strut here. Let me push that button, and you will have graphed that material. So the one thing here, the shading group, which is the thing that is actually assigning your shader to your object. It will usually have some name that it was assigned at the very beginning when you created the shader. So usually they are called something like AI standard surface 23. You don't have to name shading groups, but if you're here and you've graphed your material, and I did that at some time, but this material was imported from another file where I did some experiments with the shading of the gear. Usually, I'd go in here and I'd rename the thing based on the last connected thing here. So this is your standard surface shader. This is your material. I just go in here, remove these tags at the end and just call it SG. So it just keeps things clear. You don't have to do that, as I said. There are a lot of materials probably here where I just didn't name the shading group because I've never seen it. So I didn't notice it wasn't named correctly, but I named some of them. So yeah, that's that. Other things don't have to be named, but you should really. So even same thing as with the node editor for scene nodes, they're the same thing. So this is just set up to just show shading nodes, but basically this is the same interface as the node editor. So you can also graph your materials in the node editor. There's really no difference there. But yeah. So you can go in here and name these things. So you should, if it's a complicated setup, and if it's a complicated setup that somebody else is going to take a look at, like maybe this one, which is not the most complicated setup you can build, but it is complicated to find out what was done there. So you can label and comment things. Usually you create a lot of nodes, and I don't recommend naming everything because you really will just spend more time naming everything instead of being creative. If you are required to do that, just name things. So that's basically it for the organization. Maybe this thing here. So if you look at that, this material is called P51, the gear metal bright. So a clear identifier what it is. And there's also this tag MAT and AIS. So this MAT tag can be used to filter for them maybe in the outliner or something like that. So every material gets this little tag at the end called MAT, and AIS for AI standard. So if I search up here for a specific material type, I can type AIS and I will have filtered for all materials that are an AI standard shader. So you do have to find, maybe you don't need to, but you can find some naming convention where you just tag things with some information that you might need to filter for. So I can go in here and just search for AIV, which is my tag for AI volume, standard volume shaders. You will find the one shader I have here in the scene to filter for those types of materials. So that's the quick workflow overview introduction. And now we are ready to take apart the planes materials. So before we continue, because I don't really need to see that anymore, I will just close this browser up here, so we do have a little more space to take a look at our nodes. And let me just make that a little bit smaller, and I am gonna run our IPR so that we can take a look at the rendered result of the things that we're gonna be looking at. And there it is. So everything looks the same way as it did before. I'm gonna put that here now, and we can make it larger. I'm gonna keep those as separate windows so I can rearrange them later. and I want to lock the interface to not accidentally dock things. So we can move our camera around about right in here in this Arnold render view, which is pretty practical. I don't have to switch to the viewport at all times. So if I just am shading and just connecting nodes, I can just move about in the IPR up here. And one thing that you might want to do when kind of like taking a look at shading networks, whether you're trying to find out what somebody else did, or really if you're developing shaders and are testing your materials, there is this concept of an isolate selection. This is currently turned on. I'll turn, so this is now turned off. I'll turn it on again. And if I select, so I'm in the fuselage material right here. So that's the material, basically that's the whole material assigned to my plane's body. So all of this metal, all of this paint, the wings, the tail, etc. So basically that's everything that is on the plane. So let us take a look at that. Let's say, and I'm gonna zoom in here. Let's say this is one of the texture nodes that is coming in and loaded from disk. So this is this P51 diffuse text albedo thing. Maya says it's 1001, but the thing really is loading all the UDIMs and putting it on the things. So let's say I wanted to take a look at how that actually looks without any shading, without any of the other things that I did in the shader. I can just select that, and the Arnold IPR will show me. So whichever node I'll now select right here will be displayed on its shape in the viewport. So there is this little quirk here on the GPU where when you isolate select something, so this is just a texture in the plane, Arnold will still display all of the other objects as shaded. So basically you can't have it any other way right now on the GPU. If you want to see your objects with basically just black around them, which makes things a little bit easier, you can switch back to the CPU and you will see that changed. So on the CPU, Arnold in isolate selection will only show you the things that you have selected without any other objects around them. So since this is a material, you can see that it now will be shaded. It is one material that is being fed to a mix shader later on, but this is basically the way you would work with isolate selection. So this is a pretty handy tool while shading, because you can take a look at the thing that you're currently modifying. You can also use it as a tool to maybe understand the shading networks in the file. So to the people in my course, if you want to take a look at it and maybe find out how certain things were connected, this is pretty handy to, let's say for example, you want to take a look at the cockpit shaders here and find out how they are built. So let me just move that down here quickly because it's easier to navigate that way. And let us quickly hide the canopy right here. So I'm going to expand this group and just search for the canopy, hide it. So I still have this fuselage material read selected, but as soon as I, for example, select this material, or so Arnold is lower on the CPU. Let me just do one thing here for preview purposes. Let us just disable adaptive sampling. Let us go down to 2 samples. Progressive refinement is on. And let's search for a material that is actually easier to see right there. So let's for something. Interior dark metal. Let's go to cockpit interior green. So as soon as I have that selected, you will see that you will only see this green material that is assigned to kind of like the outside walls of this cockpit. So you can see that in isolation, you can then step through that shader and see how it is built. So you can see that this is a mixed shader. So this is basically mixing 2 materials based on another input. So what is this input? This is basically just a black and white texture So this is this mask. So this is basically blending between this interior green material and a dark metallic material. It's probably hard to see here, but this is basically a black metal with some reflections on it. So that in the end, through this mask, I get a few green dark spots on this metal. So if I quickly just zoom in here, you can see that there are this darker spots on the metal material right here. So if I, and again, this is a little bit slow because it's on the CPU, so things might just take a moment to. Nah, I hate when that happens. Please don't do that right now. So, you can see those darker spots. And if I go back to the mask right here, you can see that these spots are generated wherever this mask is white. So you can step through all of these other nodes and take a look at them and see how they are constructed, what kind of shaders are used, what kind of math nodes or range nodes are used to combine these shaders with each other. So basically, yeah, you can use isolate selection to step through your materials and take a close look at them. And as I said, as a tool during shading, you will use it to maybe select this AI range node and then tune its values to your liking, while not having to render the whole heavy output shader, or even if I turn off isolate selection here, or even the whole plane at the same time, which on the CPU will take some time, which for the rest of our look at the shading nodes means that I will go back to the GPU, because things are just so much more snappy. And I think that you can see that, because right now, if I navigate in this Arnold render view, I basically have almost real-time feedback. And things will be a bit pixelated at the beginning, but the GPU will start to clear up. So since we're on the GPU and it's rendering pretty fast, I can turn my samples back on, and it's going to render in the background until it's reached its maximum sample level. So things will clear up after a while here. But really, this is just great feedback, so you can just stumble around my plane almost if it was in the viewport. So basically, for shader development nowadays, you would want to do that while rendering on the GPU, because it's just so much faster. There are things that can't be rendered on the GPU, so you gotta take care for that and think about what can be done on the GPU and what can't. So basically, the GPU has a very limited memory depending on your graphics card. Most of them, like a RX 2080 or something like that, will have 8 gigabyte of memory. So basically, your scene has to fit into that 8 gigabyte. If you've got a 3090 or something with 24 gigabyte, you've got a bit more space to put things in there. But basically, that's much more limiting than the RAM in your computers, where you might have 64 gigabyte, 32, 128, which is much more space to store a complex scene. But this is just one plane, so it doesn't take that much RAM actually. So you can easily put that on the GPU, and even if you duplicated that maybe 10 times, that would probably still fit. After that, and with a full scene surrounding it, like an airfield and trees and something like that, things might get a little bit full on the GPU. So you gotta be careful about that, and scenes have to be much more optimized for the GPU than for the CPU. But in the end, GPU rendering is a really, really, really great and handy tool to get quick feedback on things. So before now taking apart the fuselage shader, let me change a few things here. I want to unhide the canopy so that we can see that again, because it's part of the plane and we want to see that. And I want to switch, because it just makes things a little clearer. I want to hide my warm light right here, and I want to show my overcast light because it's just a little less busy, this environment, so things tend to become a bit clearer when looking at the shading connections. So what I now want to do, I definitely want to put this up here and this down here, and let's try to work with that. So I'm gonna switch to the fuselage tab and let us walk through this quite large, not that large, but it's a thing to understand, really. Let us walk through that shading graph.